Welcome back, nerds. Fino here with a guide for the New Year's GSSR, NA edition. I'll cover the JP GSSR separately, so subscribe to stick around if you want to see that. I ranked all the limited SSR servants and placed them into tiers, so I'll be using that to figure out the average quality of each banner. If you want to see how that went down, I'll put a link to the stream VOD in the pinned comments once it's ready. One last bit of prologue. The assumption is that you don't have any of the servants on the banner. If you do, you'll have to calculate the risk of duplicates yourself. First up, we have the Scotty Banner. You pretty much can't miss with this one. It consists entirely of high A and EX tier servants. Super Orion is a powerhouse crit attacker while the others are potent supporters. Scotty is a quick card type enabler, Merlin and Himiko are immortal team components, and Sherlock grants the highly useful Invuln Pierce Defense Ignore combo. However, these aren't the highest end meta servants, which means you may want to take a peek at some of the riskier options if you're missing other high end supports like Qulight or Oberon. This one goes in the sure bet tier. Now let's move on to Koyan of Light's banner. Qulight is in the EX tier as a highly desirable Buster Loop enabler, but this banner carries a huge amount of risk. On the better side of things is the A tier Arjuna altar, but things start getting ugly after that. Raiko and Ilya are both B tier gets that you could live with since they're currently or eventually become Koyan compatible. Hijikata is a gimmicky C tier enmity servant who can output huge single turn damage if you set him up, but it's a pain to keep him alive. Cleopatra and Iskandar are the millstones tied around this banner's neck. Bottom of the barrel, D tier, outdated, and cumbersome attackers. Iskandar has high single turn damage, but he needs to be babysat and runs out of steam too quickly to justify building a team around. Cleopatra is a cope magnet, and if you're trying to spam a buff block, there are significantly easier ways of doing that. Koyan's banner is a pretty big gamble, so that's where it ends up. Now let's move on to Summer Musashi's banner. Summer Musashi herself is an A tier farming berserker. Her only real pitfall is that this summer we'll be getting a much stronger servant that directly usurps her role. Da Vinci Rider is also in the A tier. Her damage is potatoey, but her combination of flat batteries and NP refund let her fight a lot of ugly enemy arrangements that would give other art servants headaches. Murasaki is at the very top of B tier as an offensive, anti-demonic caster with buff removal resistance. I'm fond of the character, but she does require a fair bit of investment to be an effective attacker since she also pays the caster damage tax. Da Vinci Caster is in the C tier thanks to her substantial battery, which gives her potential 90++ uses, but outside of that niche, you'll find her atrocious hit count of 1 to be an obstacle. Shuten Doji is one of my favorite servants, and she's also absolutely terrible by 5-star standards. She has a high attack stat but no focus to her kit. She just kinda shits out a shotgun spray of small debuffs, and with a single hit Noble Phantasm, she ain't spamming it. D tier. The low end is pretty pronounced on this one, so it's a long shot banner. Next up is Kama's crew. Kama is a very powerful A tier assassin that's one of the best single target options in her class. Her anti-alter ego effect also lets her operate against them as well. MHX Alter has a bit of an outdated kit, but she's carried hard by her Noble Phantasm, which lets her obliterate good aligned and saber servants. In the realm of 90++ where you see a need for that extreme kind of damage, she's a good option to keep around. A tier. Regular MHX by contrast is in the B tier. She has an awkward kit much like Echan, but her anti-buffs let her operate both against riders and sabers, so there's value in that. Izumo no Okuni is a B tier attacker. I did a guide on her relatively recently, but the main issue I have is the questionable need for a single target quick caster. And then we take a nosedive into D tier with Mei Alter, a dysfunctional single target rider who's notable for getting the single least impactful skill upgrade I've ever seen. This one's dead on for being a gamble. Next up is Oberon's banner. Oberon is the crown jewel as an EX tier support. There's a gimmicky Oberon system you can do with him, but his actual utility is as an enabler for some of the sketchier coin loopers and as an injection of rocket fuel for high-end encounters like the various 90++ farming nodes. He lets you reach for immense single turn damage, and this has an amazing number of applications, but man oh man is the rest of this banner rough. Okita Alter is a B tier buster attacker. You can make her loop and she's a functional beatstick. Bunny Toria is a gimmicky C tier servant with a card shuffle mechanic. However, she's a dysfunctional attacker and keeping her on the field causes a lot of problems. Treat her like a worse summer BB in terms of utility. Jalter falls into the C tier as an attacker with strong crits, but she's been in desperate need of buffs for a while now, and they haven't been forthcoming. Summer Abigail is a D tier attacker who's stuck with a kit themed around sleep mechanics and other debuffs, which makes it very hard to maintain damage with her as your main attacker. Some people swear by her as an esports debuffer, but I see that as a very narrow application, even by esports standards. Odds are you can come up with better things to do with your team cost outside of extreme minimum turn situations. Outside of Oberon, you're in for a world of hurt if you miss on this banner, so it goes into the long shot category. Next up, Space Ishtar. Space Ishtar and Summer Kama are both generalist arts farmers. I'd say Space Ishtar is the better of the two on account of her flexibility, but they're both A tier servants. Yang Guifei fills the role of a single target arts foreigner, and while MHXX is typically the go-to for that role, Yang has her perks. She's one of the more functional damage over time servants, so if you like burn memes, she can potentially get something done. A tier. Hokusai is in the B tier as an AoE arts foreigner. AoE foreigners are generally less useful than single target ones, but Hokusai's buff removal resistance is a relevant benefit. Alter Ego Kiara is another B tier arts servant. Her utility package is truly impressive with an AoE Purge, Invuln Pierce, and Defense Ignore among other things, but she's also very potato-y, and that weakness in the damage department is what holds her back. Summer Kiara also goes in the B tier. She can do some impressive combos if you're willing to invest the brainpower, but her low out-of-the-box damage and niche class are notable drawbacks. It's a 50-50 between A and B tier servants, so odds are you'll get someone you can live with. It's got strong odds for the risk-averse. Now we move on to BBs Banner. Summer BB is a B tier attacker with a notable handlock mechanic that can be used to support highly face card dependent servants. For her part, she can buster loop, but has mediocre damage output. Demon King Nobunaga is another B tier attacker who can output quite a bit of damage if she hits her traits. She can potentially loop, so that's another plus. Her fortunes have come quite a way since her initial release, but she's still not in the upper rungs. King Protea also lands in the B tier. Her NP resistance buff enables a strange grinding playstyle, and she can potentially loop, though it's a bit awkward. Regular Abigail is a C tier attacker hamstrung with a mismatched deck and awkward skills, but single target foreigners do have some value just for filling that role. Her MP damage is also quite high provided you set yourself up to actually use it. Amakusa Shiro is a clunky and outdated servant, but he has a preemptive and unconditional AoE buff purge on his Noble Phantasm, and there is value in having this effect not tied to skill cooldowns. However, that's his only saving grace. He falls in the C tier. Being split between B and C tier is not a great place to be, but the average score here just barely keeps it out of the lowest rung, so into long shots it goes. Now we have Summer Okita Altar's Banner. Summer Okitan is a low A tier quick farmer who gets points for not needing a K-scope to do her job. Skahak is a C tier burst lancer who does impressive single turn damage, but effectively depletes herself after that turn. Targeted buff success is a cool trick, but odds are you'll be using it on Shisho herself since some of her effects aren't guaranteed. Maybe she has some potential 90++ applications, but unlike a generalist like Echan, it's a lot harder to justify Skahak. Okita falls into a vaguely similar situation with pretty much no staying power after her initial burst turn. Her on-hit buff also incentivizes putting her Noble Phantasm last in chains, and that's pretty damn awkward. C tier. Saber Astolfo's been stuck with a clunky kit since day one, and while the addition of Summer Scotty and Mighty Chains make his life slightly easier, he's still quite awkward and I'd look elsewhere for your single target Saber needs. C tier. Seishonagon is actually at the very bottom of C tier. Her base skills are serviceable and her anti-alignment and attribute damage is a decent trick to have, but her anti-Shadow Servant effect isn't particularly useful anymore, and she makes you work to maintain her Noble Phantasm pressure. Running her isn't all that worthwhile in practice. This is the C tier banner, and while Summer Okitan is nice, the risk of you getting screwed is immense. I'd avoid this one like the plague, lest you fall into despair. Now we have Ibuki Doji's banner. Ibuki Doji herself is an A tier buster looper that can punch through both invuln and defense effects, and the very obnoxious fights in Tunguska Sanctuary were a pretty good showcase of her power. Romulus Kirinus sits in A tier as a buster looper that can threaten bigger damage in boss fights with his Roman debuff mechanic. Ishtar is an A tier as well. She might not be the sexiest option in town for buster archers, but she gets the job done and has the option of running the lower cost setup without Oberon. This means she can operate with a speed that competitors like Gilgamesh and Napoleon can't. Archer Moriarty is a B tier single target archer. He spams his Noble Phantasm with Koyanskaya's help, but his mismatched deck and wishy-washy supportive attacker's skill set hobbles his potential. Brynhild is down in D tier with an intriguing targeted star absorption buff, but low staying power as an attacker. Ultrio is near the bottom of D tier with a kit that has some fancy looking buff numbers, but these effects don't really synergize into a coherent kit. He needs supports to do anything, but he also wants access to his full set of face cards every turn. This makes a mess out of your team building, and pulling this guy is a bit of a disaster. While this banner is a strong upper end, the presence of two D tier servants makes it quite volatile. A real gamble. Now we move on to Kagekiyo's banner. Tairai no Kagekiyo is in the A tier as a very robust soloist that can stay in the fight thanks to her low cooldown guts. She'll only get stronger with Mighty Chains. Ashiya is also in the A tier. He has supportive potential for chaotic and evil allies while also packing a massive 80% battery, which lets him instantly NP with any craft essence in combination with his Charge a Pen skill. In the messy world of 90++ team building, these are highly desirable qualities. Meltrellis is in the lower A tier as the highest damage single target alter ego. Her kit's a bit messy, but when you need to zero out a foreigner, she stands out as one of the better picks. Karen and Dantes both placed into high B tier as solid quick loopers. Karen is a bit potatoey, but her charge skills give her the potential to run Black Grail. Dante's on the other hand got a handy on-crit buff purge that makes him a potential threat against boss encounters with trash mobs. Voyager sits in C tier along with a bunch of other attackers from the quick is too good era of servant design, so he ends up with a very unimpressive performance overall. Jacques Desmoulins brings us further down into the depths of D tier by being a gimmicky foreigner. I've covered her earlier this year, so watch that guide if you want the details. This banner has a strong upper end, but slides down the quality spectrum as it goes along, making it quite risky overall. Gamble tier. And now the moment many of you were waiting for, the Melusine banner. Melusine sits at the very top of A tier, functioning as both a high-end single target and AoE lancer. She's expensive as hell to run in some configurations, but her flexibility and power make her one of the premier attackers in the game. Squirturia is an A tier single target arts archer that has okay skills, but a fundamentally broken hit count on her noble phantasm, which lets her spam it even without Castoria's help. With Castoria, she becomes an absolute menace. Benienma is also an A tier as a strong single target attacker with party buff removal resistance, always a highly valued commodity. Having it on a servant as good as her makes all the difference. Neurobride is a hard servant to rate, because her usefulness depends wildly on your available support roster. For Castoria-less accounts, she's a valuable loop enabler, but even if you're more developed, Neuro's anti-heaven buff is something you can work into your setups to push damage, so A tier is where she ended up. Jartra sits in the lower A tier as an effective, if somewhat potatoey arts looper. The existence of Zenobia and eventually Durga makes her power less exclusive, but you'll want to fill the role one way or the other. Muramasa ended up in B tier, which might seem a bit weird considering he has so little competition in his role, but his anemic first and second skills do hold him back quite a bit, especially when you try to do anything more complex than farm waves of 3 Lancers. FGO JP also revealed Yamato Takeru, a servant that largely power creeps him in the looping arts saber role, so our boy Shiro is on a bit of a timer. Lancer Ryoma is in the C tier as a dysfunctional arts looper, whose main saving grace is his buff removal resistance. You pay dearly for that effect in his battery though. Saber Shiki is a D tier, who gets the odd quality of life buff from time to time, but still ends up as a very clunky utility attacker. It's not really worth the hassle of building a team around her. Despite the numerous A tier servants on this banner, it ends up being quite risky. Like playing Russian roulette, except instead of eating a bullet, you have to watch Kara no Kyokai's Piss Snow episode again. Much like Ibuki's Banner, it's up there as far as gambles go, but it's a gamble nevertheless. Now we arrive at Ereshkigal's banner. Ereshkigal is an A tier Buster Lancer with a lot of utility including buff removal resistance and debuff immunity. She also benefits from an NP upgrade that pushes her damage above Lancer Artoria, who was formerly her main competitor. Gilgamesh is also in A tier as a very powerful AoE Buster Archer. There's a trait made just to increase his NP damage, which applies to the overwhelming majority of servants in the game, so he hits remarkably hard for an AoE. Some of his base skills are pretty outdated though. Saber Musashi does the most NP damage out of any single target Saber in the game, and her face cards are immensely dangerous as well. She also got a bunch of buffs she had frankly zero business acquiring. However, her regular skills outside of 5th form are quite mediocre, and without a battery to help, she's a very all-in kind of servant. There's quite a bit of RNG to her playstyle, and this can often leave you feeling exposed on the field after your initial burst turn. So despite her tremendous damage, she ends up near the top of B tier. Tamama Lancer is down in C tier. Enemy charge acceleration is a rare effect with some funny niche applications, but overall she needs even more buffs if she ever wants to be relevant again. Sigurd sits down in D tier next to Brynhild. He's held back by a thinly spread kit and hit-based buffs. Ironically, if you need an anti-dragon saber, good old Siegfried stands out as the more practical option. This one's a long shot. Our penultimate option is the Morgan Banner. Morgan is an EX tier servant primarily because she's both a powerful buster farmer and an immortal team enabler. If it were one or the other, she'd have ended up in A tier like Himiko. But because she fills both functions, she's immensely valuable for account building. First Hassan occupies a fairly high place in A tier as a dangerous soloist, and he only gets more powerful with the Mighty Chain update, which opens up the possibility to regularly crit and use his Noble Phantasm. Kintoki is an odd servant as he effectively has 2 skills, one of which only lasts for a single turn. But despite that, he has a 50% battery, he ignores defense buffs, and his NP animation is extremely fast. This combination means he'll always be relevant for situations where real-world speed matters, like grabbing Barbatos kills before the swarm of locusts gets to him. That strategic use puts him in low A tier. Summer Nero is a B tier buster caster. She can loop, but you pay the caster tax, and Caster Ku's buff opens up a much cheaper alternative for people who need someone in that role. Ivan is in B tier. He's gotten a bunch of upgrades that give him alignment damage and a battery, but he's always suffered from having so much of his power budget focused on emergency prerogative. Semiramis hangs on to C tier based solely on her access to party buff removal resistance. However, maintaining this effect with their deficient skill set is going to be quite a challenge. Odds are you're better off just protecting your main attacker with someone like Santa Nightingale instead. You have relatively strong odds for getting a useful servant, but there's always that risk of Semiramis walking up and giving you the old 1000 years of death with her palm spike, so buyer beware. Last up, we have the fabled Castoria Banner. Castoria is, pound for pound, the single most useful servant in the game, as both the premier art support and the linchpin of the Immortal team, obviously EX tier. Rhaenys is on the other end of EX tier, which might seem a bit weird to all the endgame friends watching this, but 50% generalist charge supports are worth their weight in gold for account building, and especially for pre-Oberon accounts, having access to Rhaenys can open up a lot of strategies that you simply wouldn't have the charge for otherwise. Miss Crane is near the top of A tier. She's an unconventional support and has quite a learning curve, but once you learn how to use her, you can exploit her swap mechanic to stack up buffs and snowball your main attacker. Van Gogh is also high in A tier. She's technically a support for entities of the Outer Realm, but her real value lies in her soloist and duelist strategy. 1 or 2 Van Goghs can anchor themselves onto the field and then stun lock your enemy into submission. It's an extremely powerful strategy, and one that works even with Van Gogh at a low NP level. Shi Huangdi is at the bottom of A tier. He's had a paradoxical playstyle, where he wants to be alone on the field to exploit his face card buffs, but he also needs babysitting to get resources. This is going to change with the Mighty Chain update, which will make him much more self-sufficient and consequently more dangerous down the road. Currently though, he's the booby prize of this banner. This one's another banner where you pretty much can't miss. Shi Huangdi needs some time to get online, but even still, you're dealing with all EX and A tier servants, so assuming you don't have any of these, it's one I'd highly recommend. Thanks for watching, lads. Let me know what you end up getting from the old GSSR. Like if you found this video useful, subscribe for more, and come watch me on twitch.tv/Finotaisen where I stream every weekend, 3 PM Pacific time, Friday through Sunday. Till next time.